Hello, everyone, and welcome back to an all-new episode of the Financial Confessions. It's me, Chelsea Fagan, your host, founder and CEO of The Financial Diet, and woman who loves to talk about money. And one topic that comes up very frequently when we talk about money is the intersection of money and mental health. We've looked at this issue from a few specific angles, but it's always really good to go back and speak to a professional on the topic at large because, quite frankly, as money and mental health intersect, there are almost unlimited ways in which one can both aggravate the other and help the other. Many people have remarked, and I would consider myself one of those people, that few things can be as beneficial to mental health as getting in a better financial situation, achieving higher levels of financial stability and security. But ironically, for many of us, mental health care is something that is pretty much entirely financially out of reach. Now, there can be more creative ways to access mental health care without necessarily going way over budget, and that's something I will talk about with my guest. But it's also something that, paradoxically, the more you need it, often the less means you have to access it, which is why guests like my guest today, who works so diligently in the content she creates to demystify mental health, to make it more accessible, to make it more understandable, are so important to this process. My guest today is a licensed clinical social worker, a doctorate of clinical psychology, and the quote-unquote truth doctor, as many of you may know her on social media, Dr. Courtney Tracey.
Hi, it's so great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. Did I get all that right?
You did.
Okay. As I was mentioning before we started recording, I'm always very careful when we have licensed professionals to get their credentials right. Thanks to Quility for supporting the Financial Confessions. Get life insurance in 10 minutes or less. To learn the who, what's, and why of life insurance, visit quility.com/TFC. This episode is sponsored by Quince. Shop high-quality luxury items without luxury prices. Go to quince.com/TFC to get free shipping and 365-day returns on your next order. That's QUINCE.com/TFC. And so I'd love to start kind of on that note by explaining to our audience what a licensed clinical social worker is, what a doctorate of clinical psychology is, and kind of the work you do both in your own treatment centers and on the internet.
Absolutely. Those are really great questions to start us off. So I'm a licensed clinical social worker. And what that means is that I have at least, or for other people who would have this certification, a master's degree in social work that had a lot of clinical background to the point where I was able to be licensed as a clinical social worker, meaning I can provide psychological assessments, screenings, diagnosis, and treat multiple mental health conditions. When it comes to the doctorate in clinical psychology, that's usually the degree that individuals will get when they are on the career path of becoming a clinical psychologist. Because I'm licensed as a clinical social worker, I didn't move on to get licensed as a clinical psychologist, but I do have the educational background similar to one. What this other degree provided me was the ability to understand neuropsychological tests and learn more about psychopathology and psychopharmacology. Having all of this education has led me to a career where I specialize in co-occurring disorders, which are substance use disorders combined with mental health disorders in individuals. So in my treatment centers that I own and direct, I work with young adults, Gen Z and millennials who are suffering from these co-occurring conditions. And online as the Truth Doctor, I provide digestible psychoeducation on a variety of mental health topics, as well as provide my personal story and background as someone who has multiple mental health diagnoses to show people that your mental health does not have to hold you back from the things that you want in life.
I love it. So to start kind of on the topic of, you mentioned these co-occurring disorders, you're often speaking in terms of things like substance use disorders and other mental health issues that are kind of concurrent. For a lot of, for the way that we look at it, because we're often looking at things through a financial prism, oftentimes substance use can be a way for people to self-medicate, which is obviously an issue that is extraordinarily exacerbated by financial stressors, by professional stressors, by, just how difficult it can be to maintain a job and a normal life in this economy. So can we start by talking about the ways in which substance use has sort of taken the place of comprehensive mental health care in our country for a lot of people.
This is such an important topic, and I'm so glad that you're asking. The first thing that comes up for me is something that really simplifies the problem, but makes it really easily understandable. Substance use and addiction can be deemed a choice. And, it is initially, it becomes something that can become automatic. We can make choices without knowing what we're really getting ourselves into. When you are struggling mentally, intensely, a beer costs $5 and a therapy session costs $250.
Mm.
And I think it's really important that we aren't placing blame on individuals for, taking that easier option. But we do have to understand that as human beings, we move away from pain and we move towards pleasure. And that's just how we have evolved to survive. So when someone is experiencing chronic pain, chronic mental health issues, really intense interpersonal difficulties, it can feel easier to find alleviation in a $5 drink than to try to go through the really intense process of finding an appropriate provider for you to address the issues that you have to deal with. So yes, we can have the ability to push through and to figure out the system. And at the same time, we're in immediate pain. And so I think that's the most important thing to mention right off the bat is that we are all in avoidance of pain as we should be. And substances can be a lot easier to access than comprehensive healthcare.
And I think for some people, and we've talked about things like self-medicating with substance in the absence of more comprehensive care, but we've also talked about how, especially for women, when we look at industries like the quote unquote wellness industry and industries that are sort of all about constant optimization, often through restriction, often through diet, often through, excessive exercise, all of these things, for a lot of people who may not be turning toward, abusing substances necessarily, there can also be a tendency to turn toward a constant focus on self-discipline, control and things like that, which can often, again, from everything I know, more predominantly for women, spiral into things like, for example, disordered eating, unhealthy relationships with their body, and exercise and so forth. So when it comes to striking a balance between neither sort of overindulging as a way to soothe pain, as you're saying, and move toward pleasure, nor kind of hyper restricting and denying yourself as a way to maintain a sense of control in a life that can often feel out of it, what are some ways that you sort of recommend people, some guiding principles for finding ways of living that feel kind of balanced between the two in a culture that's often pushing us in one direction or the other?
Yeah, I mean, we obviously live in a capitalistic culture in America. Money fuels our ability to survive. And interestingly enough, our culture, our society, the communities that we find ourselves in often send us messages covertly or overtly that we must prioritize the tasks that bring income into the household. And maybe, those messages are often really appropriate because, again, money equals our ability to survive. But usually the first thing that we do when our schedule begins to get busy with all the things that make us dollar bills is we push our own self-care, our own self-wellness to the side. I have had actual clients who have calendared in their self-care as part of our therapy interventions, and they will watch themselves actively delete that self-care and replace it with an income-producing task. To the
Wow.
point where the next week where they come in, they say, I now see what you're saying visually, that I am removing my own self-wellness from my schedule because of the way my life is currently set up. And even when it comes to substances, that's putting something in your body, right? To soothe yourself because it's more accessible and it can be cheaper. When I think about recommendations for individuals who may find themselves either actually deleting things off their schedule or just mentally telling themselves, I need to not be as important as this project, this KPI I need to hit, or whatever it is to realize that you are your own best resource. And the messages that we've been told, in addition to put your self-care to the side, when it comes to wellness in a positive way, have also been get a good night's sleep, put nutritious food into your body, move your body in any capacity. These are things that are also readily available, can be decently cheaper or free, depending upon the context. And so, in the same way that it makes sense for mommy to need a glass of wine or for dad to need to go betting on, the next sports game that's coming out, as ways to self-soothe, we can also find things in our environment and place things in or on our bodies that can give us the type of care that we need, and that where we don't necessarily need to be in a certain place economically in order for those things to help us.
Well, on that note, in terms of, on one extreme, you might have people who are literally, which is quite an image, deleting their self-care from their own calendars, and people who are, maybe self-soothing in more kind of overtly harmful ways. There is a concept to me in finance, in personal finance, of enough that is often very elusive. The stasis that people will find when their needs are met, when their life is, enjoyable in the way that they define it, and when they can sort of take their foot off the gas in terms of their earning, in terms of their aggressive saving, etc. That number, as I said, can be very, very difficult for a lot of people to find, to understand. It also changes throughout life. Obviously, if you have children, if you have, more substantial financial commitments, it's going to change. But I think more generally, especially in a culture that's always pushing us to consume and to seek pleasure, the concept of enough, even removed from a numerical concept in the case of finance, can be really, really difficult for people to ascertain. People, I think, often always feel, to some extent, obligated to be on a self-improvement journey, to be optimizing, to be, to perceive themselves as not being enough in some ways. So how do you personally define enough, and how do you encourage your patients and the people you speak with online to find a healthy self-image of themselves that doesn't constantly involve feeling a need to change or improve?
Yeah, this is like the question of my whole career, I think. I consider myself to be an existential psychotherapist. And what an existential psychotherapist is we really take a look at the big questions, the questions that you may hear a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, a 5-year-old asking, like, why am I here? Why am I alive? Or questions that we ask them. What do you want to be when you're older? What do you like? What do you not like? All of these questions that sort of formulate who we are and our perception of the world around us and the world's perception of us. We get those questions answered pretty quickly by other people. As we become a child, move into adolescence and young adulthood, the pressures of society, familial pressures of you must be this or make this to be successful, all of those pressures start to have us quiet down what our potential answers would be to those questions. And we start to get really consumed in the rat race. Once we're in grade school, we know we have X amount of years until we may enter college. Then we need to know what career we're doing. And that can become really stressful, and we can lose ourselves really easily.
Well, I think, to your point, and this is something that we talk about quite a lot on the channel, is coming up with a self-concept that exists outside of the expectations of others. Oftentimes when we talk about financial milestones in particular, we're talking about things that were not only placed on people externally. You have to get a certain degree, you have to have a certain kind of job, you have to buy a home, you have to do it by this time, so on and so forth. Even, obviously having children is not just a financial decision, but it's also a massive financial one. So it extends to things like that as well. But so it's not just these things being externally sort of put on people. It's also that in many cases, the expectations are based on a completely outdated economic system that no longer exists. Like these things are often quite literally not achievable for people in the same way that they were for their parents' generation. So from my perspective, when it comes to creating any kind of healthy financial relationship with yourself, it has to first and foremost involve a complete unprogramming of any kind of information that you received about what your financial parameters should be. Again, because even if the people giving them to you had excellent intentions, take something as quote unquote simple as going to college, which for many people was treated as a non-negotiable and something that was their only way to get a decent life. Not only were they put into a mortgage worth of debt at 18 years old in many cases, but they were told to do it by a person and by a generation for whom that degree cost not even a fraction of that. So to me, it's about sort of understanding that you are very fundamentally playing a bit of a rigged game, and that in order to have any kind of chance at real balance and fulfillment, you have to unlearn the rules that never really applied in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. And I think something that would be great to share with the audience is something that some people may never get the opportunity, and that doesn't mean it's a bad thing, to experience. And it's this. I have worked with individuals who have a higher net worth than I will probably ever imagine, that I could probably ever imagine. And I'm working with them because they no longer want to be alive. Mm. And so I want the people listening to think about, if you have ever found yourself in a situation where you feel caught up in your career, caught up in your relationship, caught up with your bills, caught up with feeling like you must achieve, whatever it is, and you find yourself saying, I don't want to do this anymore at all, it's important to realize that what that means is, or it's important to realize at that moment that you need to ask yourself a really important question. And that question is, do you really want to leave this life, or do you want to leave the pressures that this current life system is presenting you? And if the answer is yes to the second question, then there are different rules that you can live by in a more healthy way. Maybe it's cutting half of your to-do list and cutting half of your income if it's possible. I'm talking about people who have reached a really high level of success and now no longer want to live. It's not that the money may be making you feel that way. It may be that the strive for money is making you incapable of living. Mm. And so I think it's really important that we realize that if we're living life a certain way, financially, relationally, whatever it is, and we're feeling like we don't want to do it anymore, there are options. There are ways to reprogram your life, restructure your life, or even just think about yourself and your life in a different way. So yes, stepping out of those conditions are really important. Asking yourself, why do I think this about myself? Why do I think this about money? Why do I think this about success? Redefine those things for yourself, and you may find that those ties were not as tight as you once thought, and now you're on a different path and feel a lot happier.
Well, in terms of, what you're not directly describing, but what is something that we've talked about a lot before, which is sort of this sense of diminishing returns after you earn a certain amount of money, that more money past that often creates more stress, creates more anxiety, creates more problems than it solves, which we do see bear out in a lot of the data economically. But on a more micro scale, something that I think manifests for a lot of people financially, and ultimately in almost every iteration manifests financially because most things cost money, but is really that question of the role that more short-term pleasures and gratifications should play in life, in terms of, for most people, buying a nice outfit, or, going out to a nice restaurant with your friends, or, ordering takeout, or doing any of these little short-term things that we know should and do fit into an overall healthy, balanced life and budget, but can easily not only spiral out of control, obviously in the case of substances can become really, really destructive to the body, but in pretty much all cases can become destructive to, mental health and to people's financial well-being. How do we start to find the sweet spot where we are bringing joy into our life in a shorter term way and treating ourselves well and enjoying, the fruits of our labor without over relying on that short term gratification?
Yeah, I have a good example, I think, of this. And it was a conversation that I had it was a conversation that was had between myself and my mother a few days ago. She was dropping off my son at preschool, and I'm not quite sure what kind of car she drives. I think it's a Honda. And she texts me and says, I feel so out of place here. It's like every parent has a Tesla. And I said, oh, okay, like your car's fine, your car's great. And she said, my car will be paid off in 8 months and then I can get a Tesla. And the thing is my mom is not in a place to have a car payment. So once her car payment is done, she should really hold on to the car that's in good quality. It gets her from A to B. She likes it. She just picked it out a couple years ago. And I feel like I'm going to have this conversation with her in a few months to remind her to delay gratification and to instead benefit from saving the money that would have been her car payment for future delayed gratification. The problem that comes in when it comes to someone like my mother is that the immediate gratification in this instance is the alleviation of low self-esteem. It's the ability to feel as though you're fitting into a group. And so my suggestion, I'm not quite sure what I'll do with my mother, but if this was a situation with one of my clients, my suggestion would be to figure that out, to figure out what is the thing that you want so immediately, because it's not that you want another car payment. And it's maybe not even that you want another car. It's that you want to feel better. You want to feel a part of. And so for anyone who is maybe engaging in these immediate gratification skills or purchases that don't really serve you long term, is to ask yourself, what is the feeling that I'm getting out of these things that I'm buying or spending my time on in the immediate? And are there alternative ways to get that feeling that aren't going to detrimentally affect me financially in the future, which will then in turn detrimentally affect my mental health, which is what I'm ultimately trying to solve in this immediate moment?
As both a business owner and a person who wants to make sure that the people I love are taken care of if anything were to happen, life insurance has been a conversation that I've been having in my own personal life as of late. And being financially savvy, as you all know, means planning ahead for future you. Life insurance is an important part in financial planning because it helps make sure your loved ones are taken care of in the future. If you know life insurance is an important investment but are not sure where to start, Quility has you covered. Quility offers a completely digital quoting and purchasing experience with various 101 guides to guide you through the process. Quility's process covers how much you need, when you need it, and for how long. What people actually think costs over $50 a month can actually cost $20 a month, less than your car insurance, pet insurance, and probably less than a dinner out. To learn the who, what's, and why of life insurance, visit quility.com/TFC. As many of you may know, I am all about the capsule wardrobe. If you want to upgrade your wardrobe as we head into fall while spending your money wisely on high-quality essentials that will last beyond the season, and finally build the capsule wardrobe you deserve, Quince is the place for you. It's giving quiet luxury without paying luxury prices. Quince creates timeless classics that never go out of style. You'll have them in your closet for years to come, which is always my goal when shopping. How do they do it? Quince partners directly with top factories to cut out the cost of the middleman and pass the savings on to you. All of Quince's prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium, eco-friendly fabrics and finishes. With timeless classic pieces that won't go out of style, think suede and leather jackets, silk blouses and dresses, and even cashmere sweaters, you can start building your capsule wardrobe with Quince. I got my first few pieces from Quince earlier this summer, and I truly couldn't love them more. So in my personal experience, as you can see in this little video clip from my TikTok, I opted for a green silk blouse. I also have a pair of earrings that I wear basically every day, these little gold hoops. I've actually bought Quince stuff with my own money now, just because I really love them so much. And it was really easy shopping with them. The website could not have been easier to navigate. The pieces look and feel so expensive. Like I have much more expensive kind of luxury pieces. And honestly, I sort of regret buying them because these are just as nice, if not nicer, for a fraction of the price. And in terms of styling, you know, your girl, she loves a more classic look, maybe a little bit older. I just feel like the Quinn style is perfect for that kind of vibe. So take the drama out of planning an outfit and upgrade your closet with Quince today. Go to quince.com/TFC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/TFC and get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/TFC. Getting back to, because I think this is often like a lot of what you're describing, I think can map onto substance abuse really well in terms of self-soothing, in terms of finding an interim solution for bigger problems that are often too cumbersome or overwhelming or expensive to think about dealing with at inception. In terms of, you know, substance specifically, you mentioned that a lot of times this is sort of a co-occurring phenomenon with other mental health issues that are not being treated or addressed. I'm someone who listens to you know, I'm a fan of, I don't know if I should name drop this, but like Dr. Gabor Mate and things like that. Are you into him as well at all?
Absolutely.
Yes. So I'm a huge fan. In large part, I actually loved also Johan Hari's book, Lost Connections, on a similar subject. But I'm really, really interested in this kind of, seemingly to me, it's probably not new, but to me it seems new, way of thinking about addiction as kind of a symptom of a lot of, you know, overlapping factors that are not quite as simple and straightforward as we kind of previously thought of them, and also have often that, you know, in ways that have led to the stigmatization of people who deal with these issues. And you mentioned earlier, you know, like the wine mom thing, for example. Like, if we look at the way, you know, American mothers consume alcohol compared to at different times in history when they weren't, you know, all having to work full time while also raising children and facing diminished wages and, you know, having to be the primary caregiver and all these things, it does start to make sense in terms of like these things do not exist in vacuums, and they are, you know, a result of a lot of complicated concurrent factors. Can you talk about the way that you kind of think of addiction as it pertains to being a societal disease in that way?
This is great. And I love the last two words that you chose for this ask, because society didn't always consider substance use to be such a negative thing. Years and years and years, even before recorded history, human beings have been searching out for substances, whether that was to eat, whether that was to try to connect with some type of God or spirituality, whether they ate something and realized that it could help numb their pain. We have been doing this. We've been foraging the earth to find things that we need to make us feel a certain way, whether that's healthy or whether that's numb. And as time has progressed, we've seen things like the war on drugs, prohibition of alcohol. We've seen the government and society try to come in and regulate these things. However, oftentimes their regulation is a result of either their ability to experience financial gain or their ability to uphold certain social systems using the law to do so. So we've had this demonization of substance use in this country for so many years. And the thing is human beings haven't changed. We haven't changed at all. We are still the beings, like I mentioned in the beginning of this episode, that run from pain and move towards pleasure. It's part of the way that we survive. And so fundamentally, it makes sense that we have fallen into these habitual patterns of behavior when our world is stressful. And on top of that, as much as we've criminalized society, substances are so readily available. If you think about of course, every alcohol ad, for example, says drink responsibly. It also says either outwardly or, through subliminal messaging or whatever their metaphor is, that if you're stressed, you should have a beer. If you're feeling tension, smoke a cigarette. Doctors used to smoke cigarettes inside their doctors' offices, saying that there was no negative effects of nicotine and tobacco. And so I think we really, part of what you were saying earlier in this episode too is to step back from the conditioning and from the systems. And I think that's really important in this context too. When you're even thinking about going to get a drink, for example, ask yourself, like, why? Is it because you just saw two beer commercials and your, buddy just brought up drinking a beer and now, and you already know that it'll make you feel a certain way? It's important to ask the question of why and make sure that if you are going to make that choice, you know everything involved in that choice and you know you're making it because you want to. But I would also say it's also the opposite. We don't necessarily need to demonize substance use that's not affecting someone's life either. And so if you're fully against it and you don't necessarily have a reason to be, that might be a question too. Like, why am I so fearful of going to go have a drink with a friend or something like that? It's just stepping away and asking yourself, why am I making the choices that I'm making, and making sure that you have your own agency that's pushing you forward.
Very, very well said. I also like your point about how arbitrary our demonizations and in many cases criminalizations are. We're not going to go too far down this road because this is a family friendly program, but like, for example, psychedelics illegal in most states, and in my opinion much more dangerous drugs are totally legal and consumed all the time, and it wasn't always that way, right? Like, we can look back at the 1960s and see that it used to be like a lot of these things were perceived very differently even 50, 60 years ago, and to your point, there are a lot of really immense social and financial factors that bear down on what we consider to be unhealthy versus healthy at any given time. And one thing that I'd be interested in your opinion on as it pertains to the concept of medication. So you mentioned that your doctorate really allowed you to have a much deeper dive into psychopharmacology specifically, which is, as I understand it, the use of pharmaceuticals to aid in mental health care, I guess. I never know the exact terms, but suffice to say, we are in, so for example, one thing that I will never not find shocking is that pharmaceuticals are advertised on television. Like, that is something that I think not enough Americans know that that's illegal in almost every other country. Like, it's very unusual to be able to watch a television show and just see an ad for an antidepressant, like in between, a clothing and a, whatever else commercial. We live in a time where pharmaceuticals are in some ways more present and available than ever before. In some ways, they are still very stigmatized. In some ways, they are not able to be accessed enough. In some cases, they are abused. I would love to hear your general philosophy on pharmaceuticals and some guidance for ways that people can start to think about it in their own lives.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that pharmaceutical commercials are illegal in most other countries, because I don't think that people know that. And it's a very important point. As someone who does have a lot of education on psychopharmacology, I do have to note that I am not a medical doctor and I cannot prescribe medications. What I do is work in conjunction with my medical directors and psychiatrists at my treatment centers to determine the best course of pharmacological and non-pharmacological treatments for our clients' conditions. What we always tell our clients when they're starting medications is that they need to understand what these medications are actually doing to their bodies. And I have a lot of colleagues that I'm currently working with now, including one that just opened up a center called Clarify Meds. And all she does is help people come off of prescription medications. And the conversation currently in the field is that a lot of times patients or clients are not given fully informed consent of just how attached their body, brain, and mind can become to these substances. And there are a lot of medications that are absolutely necessary that are needed lifelong. This is medication that is medical and medication that's more psychiatric. And at the same time, my personal philosophy for my treatment centers and my clients is, outside of the medication that we are very clear you're going to need for the rest of your life, which is rare, when it comes to psychiatric medications. We want to engage you in a process where, let's say you're coming into treatment or you're coming into therapy or whatever it is, and you have zero coping skills to only maladaptive coping skills, meaning you have no idea what to do to help yourself in any given moment. And that's why you're here. We will start you on medication. So we're saying your coping skill level is none. Let's say it's none. Your medication level is also none. We know that medications can have a much faster effect in behavior change than learning coping skills enough for them to feel automatic or easily available. So we'll start to increase your medication dose till we get you at a level that makes you feel stable and capable of engaging in your life functioning again. But the goal of long-term treatment is going to be that as we are raising your level of coping skill ability, over time, we're eventually able to lower your medication dosage. And this is, of course, dependent upon specific symptoms or conditions or presentations. But oftentimes that's the goal. Oftentimes for us and what I treat, it's short-term medication use while applying coping skills until they can either balance out to be equal or we could reduce you off the medication altogether. And I do have to put a quick disclaimer that this is something that really should be talked about with your medical provider who understands your history of medications, how your current medications are affecting you, and what would happen as side effects as you titrate it down.
You know, to go back to things that are pretty unique to America, similar to being able to just see a bunch of ads for pharmaceuticals on TV all day long. There's been a fair amount of research and, ink spilled on the concept of Americans' pursuit of happiness specifically. Like, it's literally our motto. Like, we have really cornered the market on wanting to be happy, which, many smarter people than myself have written at length and studied how that can negatively impact people's lives, because happiness is not necessarily a super sustainable state. It's often pretty ephemeral. It's also often very subjective. It's also can be quite different from longer term contentment, fulfillment, validation, all of those kind of things, that it's a rather, I think in some cases, childlike perception of what the goal should be in terms of mental health. To what extent do you think people's expectation of, or quote unquote pursuit of happiness, is part of this cycle of, needing to self-soothe, of needing to seek external pleasures and validations?
I think the first thing to think about for anyone listening is that there, I would say, are two different types of happy. There's two different types of happiness. There's the feeling where you always want to feel happy. You never want to feel anything negative. And then there's also, an area where maybe the question is like, do you feel happy with your life? Of course, like the word is still feel. Do you feel happy? But you're more so thinking about your life in that moment. Of course, feelings are going to come up. We're feeling individuals. But I think it's two different things to consider. And oftentimes we're chasing the feeling of happiness constantly versus feeling content or happy with where we're at in life altogether. So the first thing to consider is that we cannot always feel happy. If we always felt happy, then we probably wouldn't have a fear center in our brain, and we would probably get hit by a car or eaten by a bear. Like, something would happen. We have these other emotions and sensations because we needed them evolutionarily. We wouldn't have them if they weren't helpful. The problem is that we live in a society that activates the emotions that can wear us down physically, psychologically, and physiologically more so than we're programmed for. It's as though we are a computer that's constantly running on overdrive, and our goal is to have all tabs closed and just be chilling. Like, that's really difficult to do when you know that you're alive, and let's say you need those tasks open to keep progressing in your life. And so it's almost like we're going after something that is impossible to achieve. Another thing that comes up for me is the saying that money can't buy you happiness. And to me, that's really a confusing statement as well for people because, like you said, happiness is very subjective. And at the same time, what do you mean when you say money can't buy happiness? I mean, are you talking about, again, the feeling of happiness? Because then it's like, well, maybe it can. Like if you've ever been to a theme park you always wanted to go to or something like that. But money can't necessarily buy you the feeling of being happy in your life, because the feeling that makes you, or the ability to feel happy in your life, is usually feeling confident and capable of managing various situations, of feeling resilient, of feeling like you can support yourself. And that doesn't mean that that's happiness. It means that it's all of these other different emotions and sometimes overcoming really difficult ones. So happiness is a really complex subject and topic. And I think before we can even really dive into like, why are we all going after this thing that we call happiness? It's also important for us to pause and say, what does that even mean to me? Because no one's pursuit of happiness looks the same.
Well, and on the same note, I mean, I think there is to go back to the concept of enough, I think there's also for each person going to be a slightly different threshold at which they feel safe. And for example, we talk a lot about how people who, for example, came from financial insecurity, had a really, really turbulent background in childhood financially, oftentimes they will need higher levels of financial security on paper in order to feel that sense of stability and contentment. But I also think, I mean, one of the studies on this topic that I read that like really changed my life in terms of my own outlook was a study about how like often anticipation of a thing brings as much or more joy than the actual thing itself, which is something that I think often gets really lost in a culture of instant gratification and consumerism and being able to buy things, is that often what we're sort of missing out on is the sort of liminal space of anticipation, of projection, of imagination, of fantasy, of, aspiration in a healthy sense of the word. And I'm interested, obviously we'll talk about it from kind of a financial perspective, some ways to do that. But from a more holistic mental health perspective, what are some ways that you recommend that people can sort of, not to put it in such a like simplistic term, but like kind of get more value out of the things that bring them happiness, enjoy them more, experience them more fully, and really sort of enhance the impact that they have on their lives?
First thing that came up for me is like watching a movie that you know that you'd love and watching it in 5 times speed. It's not going to give you the feeling that you're looking for. You're not going to experience the story or the characters that you were sitting down to experience. And we do that so often in our own lives. We live our life in fast forward because we're always thinking about the next 5 steps ahead of ourselves. And as simple as this advice is, I think it's really important that we just simply slow down. We just need to slow down. And even if that, and what I mean by that isn't even saying, like slow down more than you already are if you're someone who like does things slow, but it's like making sure that you're not living life in fast forward. Can you at least be in the present moment? Whether that's actually engaging in mindfulness techniques, whether that's taking time out of the beginning or end of your day to consolidate what it is that you experienced or what you plan on experiencing, or whether that's allowing yourself to be in the moment and actively acknowledge the things that you are experiencing. Like in this very moment, I'm sitting in front of a desk and I know I'm sitting in front of a desk, but at the same time, if I take my hands and I put my hands on the desk and I feel the desk, it exists to me more in this moment. It becomes more of a part of my life. And I think that for things that are not as non-emotional, non-alive as a desk, we also do this with the people in our lives and nature scenes that we walk by. And again, like the music that we listen to on the radio, we don't really give ourselves the opportunity to be where we are. And a lot of that does come from asking ourselves, when is enough enough? In any given moment, is it enough that you're sitting here in front of this person? Is it enough that you have a comfortable place to sit? All of those things allow us to ground ourselves and bring ourselves back to the moment and actually reconnect with ourselves more so that we can make better choices moving forward.
So you just named a couple of techniques that are free, essentially, that are pretty universally accessible. And that's something that I always want to make sure that I hit on when we talk about mental health in any capacity on this channel, because I need to acknowledge first and foremost how financially inaccessible it can be for a lot of people to have structured mental health care. I would love if you could share any kind of practical tips or advice for both more creative ways to access mental health care at a more affordable price, but also ways to integrate some of these practices that in many cases these people would be receiving in the context of clinical care without having, to necessarily engage in it.
Initially, it's hard for me to answer that question because as someone who is a very nuanced clinician, the first thing that comes up for me is there are so many different types of mental health symptoms and so many different reasons why this mental health care system may be inaccessible. So it's hard to really give specific examples other than what one might expect, which is to take care of the movement of your body, how much you can sleep, and what you're putting inside of your body. Interestingly enough, that's often what is recommended in individual psychotherapy. Part of individual psychotherapy, let's say if it's psychodynamic or psychoanalytical, that's where we're really diving into your background and trying to help you figure out the themes of your life, which isn't necessarily what people are looking for when they're looking for immediate comprehensive care for their really acute presenting symptoms. Usually, the first recommended skills or strategies are balancing out your physiology. And that's why I keep recommending what you're putting in your body, how much you're letting it rest, and how much you're moving it. It's so critical. And I think that the first question might be, well, how am I supposed to know? Or one, I can't get sleep because of the structure of my life, but thanks for the advice, right? That might be something that's coming up. Or what am I supposed to put in my body? Or how much and in what way am I supposed to move it? That makes sense. And you would get individual answers in individual therapy. For those of you who can't access it, the first thing to understand is that your body is giving you messages. And as much as those messages are negative and you want to numb them, there is a reason that they're sending them. And it's important to try to figure out what those are. If you're at a place where you don't feel like you can figure out what those are, at least something that you can do is figure out what are the messages, what are the symptoms. For example, someone who has anxiety that would want to go get treatment for anxiety. When people have asked me this question on live interviews on my social media, I give them this advice because I don't know them personally. I say, there are many different ways that your anxiety can be showing up for you. And instead of just looking up anxiety coping skills and using the first one you find, do some analysis into how your anxiety is specifically presenting for you. Is it anxious thoughts? Is it something that's more mental? Is it anxious somatic feelings, meaning it's all these physical symptoms of your heart racing and sweating? Or is it more psychological anxiety where you feel low self-esteem or have difficulty engaging in public speaking, for example? Breaking your symptoms down into those three areas, mental, physical, and psychological, can really help you get a better idea of whether that's self-help books or what you can find online or recommendations for free community activities or whatever it is. You are at least able to give yourself a more complex and nuanced solution than just taking some blanket response and having that not work because you haven't done any introspection.
Well, kind of as a final note and on the topic of introspection, so you use the moniker the Truth Doctor, which we stand trademarking that. It's such a good title. I love it. But I'm interested to know kind of what that means to you in terms of what is the truth? What are the truths about mental health care and mental health well-being that maybe we're sort of denying or we're not acknowledging?
Yeah. Well, to start off, I call myself the truth doctor because I share my truth with the hopes that I can help other people find their own. And so, what does that mean, the truth? I think something to leave people with is to understand that even from the moment that you're born, you didn't even choose the first language that you learned. Your society, your community, your parents, whoever was around you chose that for you. And that is something that is so unique to human beings on this planet, is our ability to communicate using language. And so if that in itself is something that was removed as an initial choice for us, how many other truths or aspects of our lives, like I speak English, were chosen for us before we were able to make that choice? And when we're reflecting on what our truth is, it's important to recognize and figure out, what truths have I been living my life by that I don't want to be living my life by anymore? Which ones are working? And regardless, where did all of these ideas and perspectives come from? How are they affecting me? And what can I do to change what I want to change? We often find ourselves living a lie, and we don't realize it until our life is crumbling to pieces. And we call this midlife crises. Now we're having quarter life crises, and they're happening younger and younger. We see it happening in our younger generations, even under 18 at this point. They're lost. We are lost, many of us, in understanding what our purpose is in life, what the meaning of life is, and who we really are, our true selves. So maybe it sounds overwhelming to start as far back as the first language that you learned, not being in your own control, but maybe even just taking the rest of your day after you listen to this episode and introspecting in a way where, if you have a thought or a feeling, and trying not to obsessively go too deep down a rabbit hole, but asking yourself, where did this thought come from? Or why am I labeling this feeling a good thing or a bad thing? You will find more of your true self if you give yourself the opportunity to introspect and meet yourself, potentially for the first time.
I love that. Well, thank you so, so much for being here. Where can people go to find more of the amazing work that you do?
And thank you. You can find me on TikTok, Instagram, or YouTube at the.truth.doctor. And my website is thetruthdoctor.com.
Well, thank you again for being here, and thank you all for tuning in to what was, in my opinion, a very fantastic episode. I will see you all next Monday for an all-new episode of The Financial Confessions. Thanks, guys.